non-pigmented irises, which I'm not sure why they're blue colored, but the point is they're not brown or black. And there's also a gene that controls your hairline. Some people, their hairline kind of dips downward like that. That's called widow's peak. That's a dominant allele. Whereas other people have a straight hairline. That's the recessive allele for the hairline gene. There's another gene that controls whether you have little tufts of hair right here between your first and second knuckle. And having little tiny hairs there is caused by the dominant allele. But if you have two copies of the recessive allele, you don't have hairy knuckles. And lastly, there's a gene that allows you to do this, to roll your tongue into a U shape. There you go. And so if you can do that, you have at least one copy and maybe two copies of the dominant allele for doing it. But if you can't do it, then you are homozygous recessive. You do not have a functional copy of that particular gene. Now, looking at Barbara Stanwyck there, oh, I was going to mention that I skipped the ear one. That was kind of interesting. Notice that some people's ears go down and then go upward before attaching to their face. That's called having unattached earlobes. Whereas other people, their earlobes just go straight down into the side of their head. That's called having attached earlobes. And that's the attached is the recessive trait, and the unattached is the dominant trait. So if you look at Mel, he has unattached earlobes, so he has at least one of the dominant alleles. Let's make him big U, little u. But Barbara has attached earlobes, so she must be little. She's showing the recessive trait. But she has brown eyes, at least I think she does, so she must have one of the brown eye alleles, whereas Mel has blue eyes, and so he must be little b, little b. And I don't know about the tongue rolling. Well, they're not sticking their tongues out. I think I just gave them that genotype for fun. So here's a question. If Barbara and Mel had kids, and use a Punnett square for this, what's the chance that their kids would have attached earlobes? Maybe do a Punnett square and tell me what's the chance they could have attached earlobe kids. What do you think it is? Not 3 out of 4. Well, yeah, 50-50. So let's look at Mel. Half of his sperm will carry the big U allele for unattached earlobes, but half of his sperm will carry the little U allele for attached earlobes. But Barbara, her eggs could only carry the little U allele because that's all that she has. And if you fill in the Punnett square, half of the squares are little u, and half are big U, little u. So we'd expect half their offspring, or each offspring has a 50% chance of having attached earlobes and a 50% chance of having unattached earlobes. What's the chance that their offspring can roll their tongue? We'll assume that both Barbara and Mel can roll their tongue, and they're both heterozygous for it. What's the chance their offspring can be tongue rollers? What is that? 3 out of 4, correct. If you do the Punnett square for tongue rolling, that's that monohybrid cross we did earlier. Big R, little r. big R, little r, little r, little r. Yeah, so 3 out of 4 of their offspring would be expected to roll their tongue, and 1 out of 4 of the offspring would be non-tongue rollers. All right, now, I think what came up last week, and a concept that some genes are more important to our survival and health than others. None of these are important to your health or survival. It doesn't matter what color your eyes are, or what kind of widow peak you have, or your ear shape, or hair on your knuckles, or roll of your tongue. It doesn't affect your health or survival at all. But other genes are very important for your survival. Here's this chart that represents your metabolism, all the chemical reactions that go on inside your body. You know, there's thousands of different organic molecules floating around inside you, and there's thousands of different enzymes represented by these arrows that can change one molecule into another molecule. And those molecules that we made in your body are very important. They're running all those chemical reactions like respiration and making fatty acids and breaking down fatty acids, and all those important enzymes that keep you alive and functioning are being made by genes. And so if you do not inherit at least one functional copy of one of those important enzymes, you're going to have something wrong with your metabolism. That's called a genetic disorder or an inborn error of metabolism, medical problem caused by the genes. But the exact problem will depend on which enzyme you're missing, and therefore which metabolic pathway is not functioning correctly. And to give an example of that, there's a genetic disease called phenylketonuria, or PKU for short. And the people who have it, PKU, are missing this enzyme right here. We call it the enzyme Q. And here's the story behind it. There's an amino acid called phenylalanine. And like so many things that relate to our bodies, some is good, but too much is bad. What's the effect if you have too much phenylalanine in you? Well, it can, if you're a young person where your brain is still developing, it can interfere with the proper development of your brain, and you can end up with mental retardation. But that usually doesn't happen because there's this enzyme called enzyme Q, which metabolizes the phenylalanine amino acid into another amino acid called tyrosine, which can't affect your brain development. So for babies and little kids, it doesn't matter how much phenylalanine they get in their diet, because the excess amount, the dangerous amount, is broken down by this enzyme into tyrosine amino acid. But let's say a kid was born without a functional copy of that enzyme. Well, then they can't get rid of any excess phenylalanine in their diet, and so it builds up in their brain and can give them mental retardation. That's what PKU is. So to get this, you have to not inherit a functional copy of it. So you need to be little q, in other words. But kind of interestingly, the parents don't have to be little q. What often happens with these genetic diseases is both parents are what are called carriers of the disease, which means they're heterozygous for it. Most genetic disorders are caused by recessive, caused by getting two non-functional recessive copies of an important gene. But usually the parents were healthy because they were heterozygous for it. So if both mom and dad are big Q, little q, they're completely healthy because they each have a functional copy of this enzyme that breaks down phenylalanine. And they probably don't even know that they're carriers of it, because how would you know? You don't know what your own genotype is. All you know is that you're healthy. What's the chance that they'll have a kid who's little q? By filling the Punnett square, what's it going to be? 1 out of 4, right? There it is. So every time they have a child, there's a 1 out of 4 chance that that kid will be little q, and have this phenylketonuria disease. I should mention maybe a little more about the disease. They actually test newborn babies for it every time. They do a little quick pinprick test and draw out some blood and see if the enzyme's in there. And if the baby does have PKU, they just put the baby on a low phenylalanine diet. They make sure the kid gets very little of this phenylalanine amino acid in their diet, and then after a certain number of years, I forget exactly, like 5 or 6 years, the major development of the brain has already occurred, and then after that point, it's safe for the kid to come off the diet. But, for example, if you look at some diet soft drinks, some of the sweetener, the artificial sweetener they use in those has a lot of phenylalanine in it, and so if you look closely at the label, it says, warning, phenylketonuria, don't feed your kid this diet soft drink because it contains huge amounts of phenylalanine in it. All right, now, any person of any ethnic group from around the world can potentially get any genetic disease. But that being said, in some ethnic groups, the amount of the bad recessive alleles is a little higher than in other ethnic groups. And so some diseases tend to infect more ethnic groups than certain other ethnic groups. And a good example of that is one called cystic fibrosis. In people of European descent, the incidence of cystic fibrosis is fairly high. You don't have to know the exact number, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 in 3,000 children is born with cystic fibrosis in people of European ethnic group. But in other ethnic groups around the world, it's a lot lower, like 1 in 10,000 or something. And so in European groups, there's more of this bad allele floating around is what the upshot of that is. And what the disease is, it's a lethal disease. Most babies who are born with it die in their 20s. Even if they have advanced medical treatment, they don't make it past their 20s. And what happens is mucus builds up in the respiratory tract and in the digestive tract, and eventually gets so thick the child can't breathe or digest adequately. And here's where it comes from. Here's a diagram of the anatomy. You talk about the respiratory tract, but what I'm showing you here also applies to their digestive tract. Here's their trachea, their windpipe, and these tubes out here are called bronchi. The air goes through those tubes. And the body makes a mucus. This clear layer here and here represents a mucus, just to trap dust particles that the person's breathing in. There's a protein that these cells in the trachea make that pumps chloride ions into the mucus, like this. The green things are the chloride ions. So these proteins fill up the mucus with chloride ions, and that keeps the mucus watery by osmosis. Water is attracted to wherever there's a high solute concentration, and so it pulls water from the surrounding tissues into the mucus, which is good because that stops the mucus from getting too thick. It keeps it nice and watery. But if a baby's born without a functional copy for this chloride ion pump, then no chloride ions are going to be pumped into the mucus, so no water is going to enter the mucus by osmosis, and so the mucus gets super thick, and eventually, like I said, it clogs up the airways and the digestive tract. What this woman is doing is kind of turning the kid upside down and sort of thump them on the chest, and that dislodges the mucus, but it doesn't cure the disease, and as I said, it turns out to be a fatal disease eventually. Here's another one that's associated with an ethnic group. There's a kid who has cystic fibrosis. They also get more lung infections and bronchial infections. There's a disease called Tay-Sachs disease, which again, it can happen in any ethnic group, but people who are Jewish, in particular from the Central European Jewish people, called Ashkenazi Jews, tend to get this a lot more. And here's what it's all about. In neurons, in the membrane of neuron cells, here's the membrane of a neuron cell, there's a certain lipid, and you don't have to know the name of this lipid, but it's called the hexa lipid. And again, like so many things, some of it is good, but too much of it is bad and can end up essentially killing off the neuron. And so there's an enzyme that comes down and hunts down this hexa lipid and basically destroys it so it doesn't build up to too high a level. Oop, I got the pointer pointing at the wrong thing there. Anyway, so this protein hunts down the hexa lipid and just wipes it out. But if you don't have a functional copy of that particular enzyme, then there's nothing to get rid of the excess hexalipids that build up. And so eventually the neuron's going to be killed off by just too many of these lipids being made. And that's what happens in babies who have the Tay-Sachs disease. And it's really tragic because the kids die very, very young. Even by 6 months of age, the parents can tell something's wrong. And then generally by 3 or 4 or 5 years old, the babies die. And again, there's no cure for it. They just don't have ways to fix genes yet. Okay, boy, I'm running out of time. Let me just cram in one thing real quickly here. These diseases I've been talking about so far are all recessive genetic diseases where the problem is you did not receive a functional copy of an enzyme that you need. There are a few dominant dominant genetic diseases where the mutation has caused a normal protein to take on some new function, but this new function is not good for us and it ends up harming you. They're extremely rare because it's a lot easier mutations are random things, so it's a lot easier to randomly mutate something and make it non-functional than to randomly mutate something and give it a new function. And this one you see here is something called Huntington's disease. And it's a lethal genetic disorder caused by the neurons breaking down, but it doesn't strike until